Hi, and welcome to part 2 of the news media and its efforts to make profit and how that might end up affecting content. In part 1, we took a look at the first part of the profit equation, that is increasing income. In this video, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the various ways in which media corporations, media companies, news companies, can try to decrease their expenses, what those expenses actually are, and what effect it will have on the news. So in this section we have 3 main questions. What are the main expenses of the news media? What steps can they take to decrease these expenses? And then finally, again, what effect will this have on the actual content of the news? I don't think it's much work to discover that the news's main expense is probably personnel. This is true of many organizations. For the media, this would end up being staff, reporters, editors, and in addition to salaries for full-time employees, you're going to have to pay benefits, dental, vision, medical. You'll have to have various sorts of insurance, and if you have a newspaper, for example, that attempts to cover not just the state, but the nation, but also the entire world. Wow, that's going to be a lot of reporters covering that whole area, right? And your expenses are just going to be tremendous. So one of the primary ways they're going to save money is by cutting back on staffing or trying to do what they can to limit having full-time employees. Right, because again, part-time employees are going to be cheaper because you can carve off that benefits section. They're not as pricey. You even have more flexibility, right? So newspapers and TV news and cable news seem to be doing things with fewer and fewer actual reporters. A lot of their economic commitments now are for newspapers, they call them staff writers. For TV news, the people who actually are in front of the camera. I dare say a large number of those people aren't out in the field getting news. Rather, they're the ones who are hired because of perhaps how they look or how they present information, right? So the result is that we have fewer and fewer of these sort of roving investigative reporters that are out there checking power, making sure that power's not abusing us. There are, again, notable exceptions. There's a fair number of institutions that still do what they can to keep this kind of reporter. But the economic model is ridiculously ineffective, and as a result, those organizations that try to continue to uphold high standards as far as having good staffing, as far as reporters go, find it difficult to compete in an open market where you have other news agencies that don't have those expenses. They're actually making a greater profit. Those companies are more attractive to would-be investors. So this isn't so much the choice on the part of the primary owners or even the main editors within these news agencies. It's, again, this is an institutional analysis. It's almost like these various forces, again, that the news works in the United States is causing, right, this. So we have fewer and fewer reporters, right? The reporters that do work for newspapers, more and more are moving over to what's called a freelance model. And in a freelance model, what happens is that reporters get paid per story. Some even get paid per word, right, based on the features that they end up writing. This saves the newspapers and the news programs quite a bit of money because they don't have to pay for benefits, they don't have to pay insurance, any of those sorts of things. And the model now is one where it's very efficient from the side of the paper or news program because the news agency only pays for the stories that are actually going to publish. This has a huge effect, of course, on the freelance journalists that are out there because they only get a paycheck if the paper is willing to accept the story that they have to print. This leads to what we think is a particular form of self-censorship. That is, the reporters are very aware of the ownership model of the news media. They're aware of the news media's commitment to their advertisers. And as a result, when they offer up stories to the news to be purchased, all of these things have been integrated into their choice of the types of stories they're going to cover, how they cover those. So we have this weird situation that looks a whole lot like censorship, but it's not censorship where you have some strong man who's working for a news program coming in and telling reporters, don't do this, don't do this, do this. But again, it's the very economic situation under which the news is functioning that causes these reporters who want to get paid to, again, align with, right, the set of expectations that are built in the news. More and more as a way to save money. Again, if you get rid of reporters, if you don't have as big a staff around, media outlets have to get content from somewhere. So the primary place that they get content now, for most of the news I think that you're familiar with, is a source called the Associated Press. And it's worth your time to maybe look up what the Associated Press is, how they function, right? Originally, I think it started as a sort of clearinghouse, a way for various newspapers and stuff to sort of share information, share reporters. And so what happens today is that most newspapers, most TV news programs have a subscription to the Associated Press effectively, and they pay for information from the Associated Press much in the same way that you pay for movies if you subscribe to like HBO or something, right? And just like HBO, you have then a choice, right? Do I want to watch this? Do I want to watch that? And so the Associated Press delivers up information, delivers up stories, pictures, video clips, all these things, all the different media outlets. And then what the media outlet can do is, based on its target audience, right, the people in the population that they're trying to get to reach with ads, they can select the stories that they think best fits that audience. And then typically they'll have staff writers who will go in and reformat the story in a way that fits the format constraints of the particular news outlet. And again, angles it, right, toward the particular audience that they're trying to reach. The result of this, as far as the content of the news goes, is tremendous. One of the main obvious effects is that even though it appears as though we have this huge, diverse array of news, the reality is all these different folks are all getting information from, at this point, one source, the Associated Press, right? Which makes it really look like, wow, there's not much diversity at all, right? There's not much perspective. And again, I think that for viewers or for readers who aren't aware of this, they think that by looking at 3 or 4 different newspapers and maybe catching a couple of TV programs here and there, they're getting a variety of perspectives on the news, and they're not, right? You're all just looking at the exact same thing reformatted from all these different folks. This is why if you watch the TV news, oftentimes you'll have the exact same video clip show up on multiple different stations. So MSNBC, CNN, and Fox all might have the exact same video clip because, frankly, they all purchased it from the same place. The Associated Press is also another way to actually make money, because if you do have some staffing at your news program, you do have some reporters, if they get a good story, they can actually sell it to the Associated Press and get paid. So that's actually another way that news agencies can make money. This, though, has an interesting effect, right? Because now you have photographers and video crews that will go to great lengths to get video of certain news items because they can sell it for quite a bit of money, right? It's worth quite a bit to them. Again, as far as expenses go, the reason newspapers and news programs need to spend money is they've got to get content, right? They've got to actually have news. Their primary purpose is probably selling you ads, right? But they've got to have enough news that actually attracts you as a viewer or reader, right? So we can look at 3 different phases here as far as what they might want to look for in that content. And the first is you want cheap content, right? The cheaper the content, the less you have to pay for the actual information you're putting in the newspaper, better, right? Great. So you want it cheap. The next better one than that is actually free content. Is there information that they can actually put in there that they somehow got free? I think different groups have discovered this about the news, and they now offer up news stories to the newspapers and news programs for free. So we saw this in the Gulf War #1, right? Sort of famously, the various reporters that are there supposed to be covering the war, they're all hanging out in a hotel in Saudi Arabia, and every afternoon the Pentagon press corps walks into the room, right, and hands all these reporter media packages where they've actually written up potential stories. They have really cool video clips of bombs going through windows, right, and they have pictures, and they offer it to this group of reporters that are sitting there, right, just for free, right? Here, do with what you want, and then when you're done, go back to the pool, right? And again, I mean, that's a really cheap way to go. So a lot of that information just made it just straight into the newspapers because, again, it was a cheap way to go. And probably the best content is more than cheap, more than free. What if newspapers could actually get content and then get paid to run it, right? So not only do I not have to pay to get information, I'm being paid to deliver particular information. So it behooves certain groups to subsidize certain stories, right? To say, hey, you know, now this really blurs the line for you and I as viewers or readers because, I mean, back in the day, you'd have news and then they would have a little break and then have a commercial and you knew it was a commercial and then they'd get back to news. But now with a fair amount of news stories actually being subsidized, you know, being paid for, because maybe it helps out, I don't know, Apple sell an iPhone or this, that, or the other, right? Now it's really blurred that line for us as consumers of news as far as what's actually sponsored content, what isn't, and I think it's made things really difficult. Another thing that is affected by this attempt to save money would be the verification of the news, right? So I think as a consumer of news, I have the expectation that before information shows up on TV or in a newspaper or in a magazine, the primary editors of that entity have gone out and verified that news is indeed true. But let's be really clear here. That verification process is going to cost money again. And here our whole goal, right, what we're talking about in this part of it, is trying to, those news outlets need to find ways to decrease expenses. So what we found is the just huge increase of things in the news that say things like according to Pentagon sources or according to corporate sources. And once they give that little tagline, boom, right, they just lay that story out right verbatim the way they got it. They transmit it at face value. And I think the idea is that since they told you this really vague sort of source, now the moral obligation's on that group. They're not reporting that news in a weird way. They're reporting that this group said this. And the difference is really important because, again, I don't think a lot of this stuff has actually been verified. Again, there are notable exceptions, right? There are certain news outlets, NPR is a great example, they go to great lengths to verify all those stories. The problem is new NPR functions under a different economic model. They don't quite have to be as competitive. But if some regular corporate newspaper were to start doing this with regularity, now something again happens, right? Their operating costs go way up. Now their profit shrinks. And if their profit shrinks, lo and behold, investors are going to go elsewhere, right? They're not going to be as interested. And you're just like, wow.